Welcome, Dr. Aubrey de Grey, to Madrid, Spain. You are going throughout the world talking about longevity, rejuvenation, research, and at the beginning of February, we were in a fantastic conference where you were one of the main speakers, and a new report was released, Longevity Industry in the United Kingdom. And people talked about billions and billions of dollars of investment. Can you tell us what happened in this Longevity Leaders Forum?
So that was a conference that actually is one of a really increasingly frequent series of conferences happening all over the world over the past year or two, and of course, continuing forward into the future. The past couple of years have seen the emergence and the extraordinary exponential growth of private sector involvement in the rejuvenation concept. The concept, of course, dates back 20 years to the point where I first started saying that we might be able to repair comprehensively all of the damage that the body does to itself throughout life. And for a long time, even scientists were not taking it very seriously. They thought that it really couldn't work. It took me maybe a decade to really make it mainstream and get my colleagues in the scientific community to take it seriously. But then after that, to be honest, I thought it was going to take a lot longer than it has to get investors interested. What's actually happened is that investors have run ahead of my expectations, and they've started getting involved in things that are really early stage, very high risk, high reward, speculative investments that are bringing far more money into this research than what could ever have been brought in purely philanthropically through the foundation that I founded a long time ago now. So it's really remarkable, and it's going to make a huge difference in hastening the point at which we really reach longevity escape velocity.
Wonderful. And right now you are here in Madrid and you are speaking at the World Law Congress with the most important lawyers throughout the planet. And what are you going to tell the lawyers?
Well, I'm going to tell them how they should prepare for a post-aging world. This is actually the kind of thing that I'm trying to get across to a lot of different communities right now. Not only lawyers, but also people who run insurance companies or people who run pension funds. Everybody whose business heavily relies on understanding the relatively distant future. But actually the message that I want to give to these lawyers, and the message that I give to a lot of people, is that the fact that we're talking about the relatively distant future in terms of the final outcome, a post-aging world, does not mean that we can just wait and see. It means that we have to anticipate what's going to happen, because what's going to happen first is that the wider world, the general public, are going to have an extraordinarily sudden and dramatic change in their own expectations of how long they are going to live, and of course how long they're going to live in a healthy, able-bodied state. That is going to influence their spending decisions. And when I say spending, I don't just mean what they buy in the supermarket. I mean the big ticket items, what kind of life insurance they want, what kind of pensions they want, what kind of inheritance arrangements they want. And of course, lawyers are heavily involved in all of those things.
And we are going to have two former presidents of Spain, Rodríguez Zapatero, and also from earlier, Felipe González. And the King of Spain will be closing with the President of Portugal and with the President of the government, Pedro Sánchez. So do you think these politicians and the King of Spain will understand some of these issues and apply them to their own personal health?
I hope so, but actually it doesn't so much bother me whether they apply them to their own personal health. What I want to do is to try to inspire these people to use their influence. The great thing that people like that, people in the royal family of major countries, and also people who are ex-politicians, who have been at the top, that what they have that people who are currently in politics do not have is freedom. People who are in politics today, worldwide, doesn't matter which democracy you talk about, at the end of the day, there's only one thing that really determines what they choose their priorities to be, namely, what's going to get them re-elected. What we need to do is to exploit the influence that is possessed by people who don't need to get re-elected anymore, because they're past that, and yet who still have enormous power in terms of their influence on public opinion. Those are the people that I want to influence, and that's why I'm so happy to be here.
And from Madrid, you go to Portugal. What is going to happen in Portugal?
Well, actually, in Portugal, I'm going to be speaking to youngsters. And that's also really important. I do a hell of a lot of public speaking all over the world, but I go out of my way to identify opportunities to speak to undergraduates and graduate students and even high school students sometimes, because these are people who will, as in anything, they are our future, and they are in many ways easier to inspire. They have not been ground down by failure the way that most of us have who are in middle age. They still have the ability to aim high and to think big. And so when I tell them about the biggest thing that can possibly be done by humanity, the elimination of aging, they get interested.
Actually, your topic in Madrid also is about human rights, and the first human right is the right to life, the right to live, the right to be alive. You agree with that, I imagine?
I would actually go further. I think absolutely it's true that the most fundamental human right is the right to life. But if we ask what's the next most fundamental human right, it's the right to health. And that's actually a really important thing to emphasize, because it's incredibly frequent, incredibly ubiquitous, that people will forget that. They will somehow divorce these things. And when people talk about ending aging or developing medicines against aging, then the knee-jerk reaction is very often to presume that we're developing medicines that will keep people alive in the poor state of health that is typical of older people today. When in fact, what we're doing is the exact opposite of that. The idea is to extend the youthful, healthy life, and the postponement of death is a side effect of that. If we get that across, then we sweep aside almost all of the so-called controversies and ethical ambiguities that people so often raise.
And from Portugal, you go back to California, but you are organizing or co-organizing many other events, like a very important one in Berlin. What is happening in Berlin? Who will be there, and what will you be doing?
Yeah, at the end of March the 28th through 30th, we'll be organizing the second of a series of conferences that we're doing every year in Berlin, which are being sponsored by one of our major donors, Michael Grever and his foundation Forever Healthy. They give us $1 million a year for our research, and they also sponsor this conference. And it's enormously valuable that this is happening. Way back in 2003, more than 15 years ago, I started a series of conferences that ran every alternate year in Cambridge, England, and that was an enormously valuable way to bring everybody together, not just the scientists, but also the gifted amateurs, so to speak, and also scientists who would never normally go to the same conferences, because their expertise was so diverse and they didn't necessarily think or realize that their work was actually relevant to the defeat of aging. That conference series pretty much ended in 2013. We ran a few conferences in California that had a different focus. And then Michael came in a couple of years ago and said, listen, we should do this again. We should do it the way you did in Cambridge. And he is sponsoring this, and it was enormously successful a year ago. And of course, we're running it again just 6 weeks from now.
In Germany also there is a very important movement towards health research, longevity, anti-aging, and also here in Spain. So what do you think are the political implications, and what should politicians do to push this forward?
I believe that politicians at this point are not yet realizing that they can actually get votes from this. Their attitude is, well, they'll follow public opinion because that's the best way to get re-elected. And public opinion is still a bit like prehistoric on this. Public opinion is not really sophisticated. People still think wrongly about aging. I believe that there is the opportunity at this point for politicians to start leading public opinion rather than just following it. To start going and saying, look, we actually understand that aging is simply an aspect of medicine. This is something that we should be able to tackle with medicine, with regenerative medicine, and we will be able to keep people healthy. And yes, the world will be very different once we start to be able to do this really well, but it will be different in a bunch of incredibly good ways, because having no sick people around sounds pretty good.
And if you had to tell our public here, what do you see coming in terms of treatment, commercialized therapies, pharmaceuticals, etc.? What do you see happening, and if you have any timetable?
Well, first of all, what kind of treatments they're going to be. There's not actually going to be all that much difference in terms of how the patient, the recipient of the therapy, sees things from what we see today. The only big difference is going to be that it's going to be more preventative. The norm is going to be that you will get these treatments before you get sick, rather than when you're already going downhill the way things are normally going today. And that's a big difference in a way, but of course we already have some preventative medicines like statins, for example, for high cholesterol, or ACE inhibitors for high blood pressure. So it's a shift, but it's not a complete starting from square one. Time frames, of course, this is pioneering technology, so we have to emphasize that it's very speculative. But I think we have at least a 50-50 chance of getting all of this comprehensively working to a point where we can basically forget about aging within maybe 18 years from now, maybe even less than that if we're lucky.
Our friend Ray Kurzweil is even more optimistic. In his latest book, The Singularity is Nearer, that will come out later this year, he talks that we will reach longevity escape velocity in 10 years, and that in his own personal case, because of all the treatment he already follows, and all the pills and supplements and so on and so forth, he says that he himself, in 2 years, might be able to reach longevity escape velocity. What do you think about that?
Well, every individual is different. Ray drew a lot of short straws health-wise. He has a lot of cardiovascular disease in his family. He came down with type 2 diabetes in his 30s, which is not unheard of, but it's pretty rare. I think it's quite likely that his supplement regime has given him a whole bunch of extra years of health over the past couple of decades. However, that doesn't necessarily translate into everybody. So we'll see. I don't really want to make any promises here. Fact is, for any pioneering technology, it works only when it's actually done. And the main thing is that we should not let that uncertainty of time frame deflect us or limit our enthusiasm, our efforts to push this forward as fast as we can. My take is that 100,000 people or more die every day from aging. So every day that I pull that back, that I hasten the defeat of aging, I'm saving 100,000 lives. To me, it doesn't matter which 100,000. If I'm bringing it back a day 20 years from now or 30 years from now, it doesn't matter.
So these are really incredible times, like in your book, El fin del envejecimiento, ending aging, in other books where you have written here, El próximo paso, in my book where you write the prologue. So all this is becoming available to everybody, at least for people to know what is coming. So you are very optimistic now as compared to 20 years ago when you began?
Well, in a way. 15 years ago it was when I started making time frame predictions. And back then I said that I thought that we would reach this point of longevity escape velocity in about 25 years with 50% probability. So actually it's only come down half as fast as I was predicting. It's come down by 7 years in a 15-year time frame. That's pretty bad news. But the good news is that the only thing I was over-optimistic about was the availability of enough funding to get the research done. If we look back over these 15 years and we ask what happened in the lab, in the actual science, there was no bad surprises at all. Everything went according to plan. all of the surprises that have happened over that period have been good surprises that have allowed shortcuts that made things easier than we might have thought they would be. So if we'd had the money, we would have saved a lot of time. But now, of course, as I mentioned, with the private sector getting involved, with visionary investors getting so active, that problem is going away.
You mentioned something very important, also the private sector. So we have the government, we have big companies, we have entrepreneurs. Where are all these technologies going to come from? Who is developing them?
Well, one thing that distinguishes this industry at this point, and which I believe will continue to distinguish it going forward, is that the people who are really leading it are so mission-focused. You know, it's not just me. I'm obviously, you know, you can't look at me and think I'm in this for personal financial gain. I'm obviously an unmaterialistic kind of guy. But the amazing thing, the fantastic thing, is that the leaders of these companies, the CEOs, and also the investors, are also that way. Yes, they want to make money. Yes, they want to do well. But the fact is they want to do well by doing good. And that is not going to change. These people will not let investors come in and divert the direction of these companies in a more short-termist but ultimately unscalable direction that ends up being a waste of time. That did happen 10, 15 years ago with isolated startups that were founded with the best of intentions by some of my colleagues, but we've learned the lesson of how not to make that happen. And now, with the investors that are coming in, with the type of investors that are coming in, that are also very mission-focused, it's not going to be necessary to take the wrong kind of money.
And for our public here in Spain and Latin America, in the Spanish-speaking world, how do you see Spain? How do you see the role of this country, particularly right now, compared to other nations, and compared to what you see is possible?
This is very much a global crusade. There are scientists all over the world that are making important contributions, but actually Spanish scientists are making an enormous difference. One of the most important Spanish biologists in the whole country, the person who runs the CNIO, is a gerontologist who has for a very long time been a pioneering scientist in this area, great friend of mine. She's been on our scientific advisory board since forever, Maria Blasco. That's just one example. I could name certainly half a dozen other really important gerontologists, people who are working on the biology of aging and making really great breakthroughs, and also taking those breakthroughs through to the private sector. Some of those scientists have moved abroad to the US and elsewhere, but they're still Spanish, and they're doing fantastic work. So yes, I believe that Spain is entitled to take great pride in the contribution that it is making to this mission, this crusade.
Well, Aubrey, I can only tell you thank you so much for being back here in Madrid, in Spain, to talk about these important issues that will change the life of all of us, you, me, and everybody else. So thank you once again.
Well, thank you. It's always great to come here. Good. No? Good. Anyone would think we'd done this before.